So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining this event today. We're pleased to have you all with us, and I'm sure many more will join us, as is usually the case for our side events. So I'm very pleased to invite you to this event in partnership with the Islamic Development Bank and the United Nations Development Program. My name is Kishan. I'm the team leader in the Arab region with the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And today's topic on climate change, peace and security is an important one in this region, as in others, and an important one when we think about the implementation agenda going forward. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our host, Dr. Abdul Hakim Alwar. Dr. Alwar is the Director for International Cooperation and Resource Mobilization at the Islamic Development Bank Group. He is an environmental scientist by background, a former Minister of Environment in Libya, and he's also a former president of the Africa Ministerial Conference on the Environment. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Alwar to the podium. Sir.
Thank you very much, Hisham. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum jami'an. I'm actually here representing His Excellency Dr. Bandar Hajjar, the President of the Islamic Development Bank Group, who apologized as other meetings with some heads of states are going on, so he had to leave. As Hisham introduced me, I coordinate international cooperation as well as mobilizing resources and also partnership within the Islamic development and supporting the group members as well. Excellency and Mr. Magdi Sulaiman, the Assistant UN Secretary General, also the UNDP Assistant Administrator, Director of the Bureau for Policy and Program Support, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum again. I am pleased to address you today on behalf of the Islamic Development Bank Group. I thank the UNDP for collaborating with us to host this event at our pavilion of the Islamic Development Bank Group. This is a testimony of the strength of our partnership, which has crystallized over the recent years. The theme of our joint event is climate change, peace and security. It's a reflection of the need to take into account peace and security in our efforts to address the challenge of climate change. When people live in an atmosphere of constant turbulence, conflicts, uncertainty, and fragility, no amount of resources or program drawn up for climate change can make a difference. Peace and security are critical success factors for effective implementation of national climate action plans. In recent time, we have seen mass forced migration and increased refugees across some regions. We have also seen proliferation of conflicts and wars around the world, which is exacerbating the conditions of the poor. Consequently, children and the aged people bear the burden of these challenges as education systems are disturbed, and cost of healthcare becomes out of reach to the common people. So are farmers who are forced to abandon their source of livelihood to seek safety elsewhere, resulting in farm produce unharvested, contributing to food insecurity. Climate change can cause forced migration and displacement of people. It is estimated that by 2050, some 200 million people will become climate migrants. This shows how complex the linkage between climate change and migration. The implication of this figure is that countries of climate migrants will experience shock of food security, while their recipient countries will be burdened with the requirement to cater to climate refugees. In both groups of countries, there is knock-on effect on security and peace. As a development institution, we at IDB Group see peace and security as foundations for a stable and prosperous future. We know that development cannot take place in an atmosphere of instability and insecurity. With climate change becoming a new global risk and an existential threat, we need to encourage our member countries to prioritize security and peace in their development agenda in order to consolidate gains made over the years to leapfrog the development. We at the Islamic Development Bank Group have been promoting peaceful coexistence and mutual respect among different communities and groups in our member countries. We shall continue this strategy as we move forward to support member countries in implementing their climate change action plans. In fact, this short intervention probably touches on direct climate impacts on farmers, or the other way around, the impact of peace on farmers, where we simply say that in the lack of peace, farmers would abandon lands and will not have harvest to produce. The reverse effect is much greater. It's more frightening. If we know that the rise of sea level is going to cover some 70,000 islands, an island like Comoros will disappear, and half of Indonesia and Jakarta and Malaysia, then we know that we have to think of where these people are going to move. And this is what can be called real climate refugees. So with that, I think we'll stop our intervention at this level and hope that the deliberations of the panelists will bring in more ideas and hopefully shed some light on possible way forward in addressing peace and security and climate change. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elwar. Very inspirational points. It's my distinct pleasure to invite to the podium next our opening speaker, Mr. Magdi Martinez Soliman, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, Assistant Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, where he leads the Bureau for Policy and Program Support. He is UNDP's senior focal point for the 2030 Agenda. He was UN Resident Coordinator in Mexico, Executive Director of the UN Democracy Fund, and UNDP's Global Governance Practice Manager. He's been working for the UN for 20 years, including in Senegal, Bangladesh, Burundi, and Togo, and has previously held senior responsibilities in the Spanish government. He is a lawyer by training, and it is my pleasure to now welcome Mr. Martinez Soliman to the podium. Sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Abdul Karim Elwar, Director of International Cooperation of the Islamic Development Bank, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Kishan Kodai, the Team Leader, Sustainable Development in the Arab States of UNDP. To all of you, Assalamu alaikum. Allow me to begin thanking the Director for International Cooperation and Resource Mobilization of the Islamic Development Bank on behalf of the President of the IDB for co-hosting this important event with UNDP, as well as the League of Arab States, Columbia University, and the governments of Iraq and Germany for being with us today. A good afternoon to all the distinguished panelists as well. Thank you very much for contributing to this discussion. As most of you would know, the Arab region was the birthplace of agricultural civilization, and for thousands of years it has been able to cope with risks from climate disasters. But climate change is now happening at an unprecedented pace, stretching the ability of societies and states to cope. Temperatures are expected to rise faster here than the global average, making parts of the region uninhabitable by mid-century. From 2006 to 2011, the region suffered one of its worst ever climatic disasters. In Somalia, a record drought killed up to a million people. In Syria, the drought decimated the livelihoods of more than 20% of the rural population, internally displacing up to another million people and exacerbating social vulnerabilities in advance of the conflict. Climate impacts have likewise destabilized social cohesion in the Sudan, in Yemen, in Iraq. It is no coincidence that these last countries, Iraq's intended nationally determined contribution, the INDC, highlights in clear terms the importance of the nexus between climate and conflict. Unless actions are taken, impacts will be felt in loss of agricultural livelihoods, high unemployment, especially for young people, mass displacement, as Dr. Elwar just highlighted, conflict over resources, pressures which all converge to derail hard-won development gains. We have a collective responsibility to help combat the slow violence inflicted by climate change on the most vulnerable people in society, who are also the least responsible for the climate change in the first place. So, what can we do concretely to help? This year marks the start of a new chapter in the cooperation between the Islamic Development Bank and my organization, the United Nations Development Programme, who signed a global memorandum of understanding last May to expand and solidify our joint work. Climate change is a key area for action under the new MOU, which aims to develop new joint programming on climate resilience to move from dialogue to action. You know that Paris was called the COP of the agreements, and Marrakesh has been called the COP of the action. So action-oriented we are. UNDP is stepping up to the challenge. We have and manage an almost $3 billion portfolio of climate change projects active in over 140 countries. We are one of the largest providers of technical and financial assistance on climate change, and this includes cooperation in many countries facing both climate and security pressures around three key priorities. First, resilience-based approaches to development. UNDP supports local partners, local organizations, local governments to enhance climate resilience of agriculture and irrigation systems, expand early warning, and put in place social protection measures like a climate index insurance to prevent pressures on food and water resources from triggering social vulnerability, conflict, and displacement. Number two, enhancing transboundary governance. Climate change amplifies competition for resources in communities, but also transboundary disputes between countries. This is even more the case in the Arab region, the world's most water insecure region, and where the vast majority of water resources span national boundaries. UNDP is scaling up action to build regional partnerships, for example, supporting Chad, Egypt, Libya, and the Sudan to design and implement transboundary agreements on use of the Nubian groundwater system, the world's largest fossil aquifer. And finally, climate-resilient recovery. Communities hosting refugees and internally displaced persons, many very generous communities in the Arab world, are also climate risk hotspots themselves, suffering water scarcity and severe droughts. The protracted nature of the crisis facing the region requires longer-term measures to reduce the vulnerability of affected communities. Recovery efforts for infrastructure, livelihoods, and basic services must therefore factor in climate risk. We are now supporting solar solutions in Darfur to rebuild the livelihoods of returnees from conflict, as well as access to sustainable energy for communities in Lebanon hosting Syrian refugees, and decentralized solar solutions for farmers internally displaced by the conflict in Yemen. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement depend on bottom-up local leadership and action for the poorest and most vulnerable in society, addressing the converging crises from conflict and climate change is a critical agenda. The Paris Climate Agreement is not only a global environmental agreement, it can also be a positive force for change, with new partnerships supporting resilience-based approaches to development and creating the foundations for peace and security in the 21st century. We certainly hope that this will be the case for the Arab region and beyond. Let me thank you very much and wish you a great success in today's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now we're going to move next to our keynote presentation. And we have with us, we're really pleased to have with us Dr. Colin Kelly, who is a senior research fellow with the Center for Climate and Security. Dr. Kelly is a climate scientist focused on climate variability and change, particularly drought, and how it affects the vulnerable in the world. He has published cutting-edge research on the relationship between climate change and drought in Syria and the broader Middle East region, and is a regular commentator on this subject. I invite to the podium Dr. Kelly for the keynote presentation, please.
Thank you very much for joining, and thank you to Kishan and the UNDP for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. I will provide a technical overview touching on some of the issues that have already been referred to here, and maybe set the stage for some rigorous discussion, I hope, in the question and answer panel discussion to follow. The central theme of what I would like to discuss today really touches on resilience and vulnerability. Arid and semi-arid regions, as we know, are inherently water-stressed and highly vulnerable for a number of reasons. Poor governance and resource management are key factors. Population growth is increasing the demand for resources. Groundwater, vital for irrigation purposes, is declining in many regions at an unsustainable rate due to overuse. High vulnerability and low resilience can be thought of as two sides of the same coin. Therefore, when nations with high vulnerability experience climate change or extreme weather or climate events, they can be pushed beyond their thresholds of resilience. This occurred, as we know, with disastrous consequences in Syria, leading to a global refugee crisis. Here I will compare and contrast some modern cases linking climate and migration, and begin with some historical examples. This is a diagram showing the expected population increase. In 2050, we can expect that there will be 9 billion people on the planet. We're a little over 7 billion right now, so that's quite a dramatic increase over the next 35 years. On the right, you can see that a lot of this population increase comes from the Middle Eastern region. On the left, this is a figure from Famiglietti et al. In Nature Climate Change from 2014, showing the decline of the largest aquifers in the world globally. And what you can see is that the Arabian aquifer is one of the steepest declining aquifer groundwater depletion globally. So a lot has been talked about the climate, food, and water security nexus. The links between climate, water, and agriculture are fairly direct. Climate forecasts are used effectively to make agricultural decisions. The links between climate and health, heat stress, malaria, etc., for instance, are more complex and indirect. And even more complex and indirect are the links between climate and migration and conflict. Many factors obviously can influence civil unrest, including governance, economy, religion, access to food, water, healthcare infrastructure, and others, and these all vary on different scales, both in time and in space. Therefore, monitoring of resilience and vulnerability, much less prediction of migration of conflict, is quite challenging. This is an example. The rise and fall of ancient civilizations has often been linked to climate variability and climate change. This is not really a new idea. This is the example of the Mayan Empire from over 4,000 years ago, the Khmer Empire of ancient Cambodia, the Roman Empire, the Akkadian Empire of ancient Mesopotamia in this same Fertile Crescent region over 4,000 years ago, Which brings us to the present, climate change in the modern Middle East. This is a quote from Lily Veld, director of the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry and professor at the Cyprus Institute. In the future, the climate in large parts of the Middle East and North Africa could change in such a manner that the very existence of its inhabitants is in jeopardy. Prolonged heat waves and desert dust storms can render some regions uninhabitable, which will surely contribute to the pressure to migrate. Europe is in the midst of a migrant crisis, with thousands of people seeking to start new life in the West. Lily Veld went on to say that the impacts of such temperature increases in the Middle East and in North Africa, home to hundreds of millions of people, would only increase the amount of people migrating. Wars, conflict, and persecution have forced more people than at any other time since records began to flee their homes and seek refuge and safety elsewhere, according to a new report from the UN Refugee Agency. Globally, 1 in every 122 humans is now either a refugee, internally displaced, or seeking asylum. If this were the population of country, it would be the world's 24th biggest. We are witnessing a paradigm change, an unchecked slide into an era in which the scale of global forced displacement, as well as the response required, is now clearly dwarfing anything seen before. This is from UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres. This report detailed how in region after region, the number of refugees and internally displaced people is on the rise. In the past 5 years, at least 15 conflicts have erupted or reignited, 8 in Africa, 3 in the Middle East, 1 in Europe, and 3 in Asia. Disasters associated with the slow processes of environmental change, drought, sea level rise, desertification, demonstrate again the growing importance of climate change as a driver of disaster risk. Internal displacement is a reliable barometer of the scale of humanitarian needs around the globe, and last year there were nearly 28 million displacements associated with conflict, violence, and disasters in 127 countries, including 19 million forced by natural hazards. In 2012, after the Arab Spring uprisings occurred, a briefer by the Center for Climate and Security in Washington, D.C., highlighted the possible connections between climate change, drought, natural resource management, and instability in Syria, drawing on important research released in 2011 by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association and the UNISDR. On the left, this is from a scientific paper from Hurling et al. In 2012, showing the aridification of the greater Mediterranean, but with particular emphasis in the eastern Mediterranean and over the Fertile Crescent. And on the right, a paper from Glick, 2014, showing the average annual discharge of the Euphrates River measured at the Turkey-Syria border, and you can see the clear decline. So this brings me to a paper that I published with my colleagues in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in 2015. A lot of the information, the drought, the severe drought, and the fallout from that drought, the internal displacement, was fairly widely known. But what we wanted to do was take that a step further and be able to begin to quantify the influence of climate change on the severity of the drought and see if we could say something important about how unusual that multi-year drought was and how it was influenced by climate change. This is the first figure, and it shows in the top panel the decline in rainfall over the last 100 years or so. The brown hatching, particularly you'll notice at the end, these are the multi-year droughts, 3 or 4 year droughts combined, below normal precipitation consecutively. And you can see that there was a severe multi-year drought in the 80s, in the late 90s, and then this most severe multi-year drought in the years right before the uprising in Syria. The second panel from the top shows the increase in temperature over that same period of time. And in the pink that you can see at the end, that entire 25-year period has been above the long-term climatology every single year. This is important because the increases in temperature serve to dry the soil, exacerbating the overuse of groundwater. On the bottom, we show the increase in population in Syria and as a proxy for the demand for water. And you can see that Syria's population in 1950 was on the order of 5 million and has increased to nearly 25 million lately. That's a tremendous increase on the stress of resources, particularly water, in an agrarian society. So one of the questions that we wanted to answer, in addition to establishing that this most recent multi-year drought was the most severe in the observed record, was how much did climate change contribute to that? So what we did using some statistical techniques was remove the climate change signal from the observations and then compared the two distributions. And what we found was that it was 2 to 3 times more likely to have a drought of this severity when you include the climate change signal versus in its absence. This also bears out the same relationship in the climate change models. The global IPCC models do a fairly good job of recreating the climatology and the variability and the trend in the Eastern Mediterranean. And surprisingly, they came up with almost identical result, saying that it was 2 to 3 times more likely to have these severe droughts under climate change. Recently, there was new supporting evidence. They determined from a tree ring network in the Old World Drought Atlas over the greater Mediterranean that with very high likelihood, 89%, that this recent 15-year Levant drought is drier than any comparable period over the last 900 years. This is strong evidence indeed that the recent droughts that we've seen are not natural variability. These are outside the distribution of what we can expect under natural variability. This is far outside that range. Of course, it's not only droughts that we need to be concerned with. Heat waves, as we know, has been occurring in India. In Regional Environmental Change, there was an article in 2014 stating that the intensification of future severe heat waves in India and their effect on heat stress and mortality that are more likely to continue into the future and strengthen. Another example, Yemen. Yemen is one of the poorest nations in the Arab region and one of the most food insecure nations in the world. Its agriculture is strongly dependent on annual precipitation and on groundwater extraction for irrigation. Yemen has seen conflict arise in the past from land and water disputes on different spatial scales, and of course is now embroiled in chaos and conflict. The ongoing civil war has worsened the already poor living conditions. Yemen is acutely vulnerable due to many geopolitical and socioeconomic factors, and these vulnerabilities make Yemen highly susceptible to climate change, which acts to exacerbate existing insecurity. This stems predominantly from unsustainable groundwater use, robust population growth, of course poor governance, and cot production, which is highly water intensive, and other factors. Even before the current civil war erupted, the situation in Yemen was dire, characterized by large-scale displacement, civil conflict, and food insecurity, high food prices, endemic poverty, diminishing resources, and influxes of refugees and migrants. As a result of the ongoing conflict and insecurities, the number of internally displaced persons within Yemen has now exceeded 1.5 million. Prior to the 2011 uprising in Syria, it was widely viewed by many experts as stable and largely immune to the effects of the Arab Spring, and certain popular indices of nation-state fragility corroborated this belief. But we now know this not to be true. So this leads to the conclusion that while prediction of state failure or conflict is clearly a highly complex task involving numerous variables, there's strong reason to believe that closer examination of regional climate change and resource availability change could greatly improve these existing state fragility indices, providing decision makers with better information. And new and improved tools are being explored as we speak. I'll close with some projects that are going on at the International Research Institute that I work. I'm an associate research scientist there. This is the Food Secure Project, which is a project of the World Food Program. It's a financial instrument, and it specifically links climate and hazard forecasting with flexible multi-year financing, which provides governments the means to unlock this funding to scale up food and nutrition responses and to build some resilience before and after climate-related disasters occur. Another example is ENACTS, led by the IRI. It's a unique, multifaceted initiative designed to bring climate knowledge into national decision-making by improving availability of this knowledge, access to and use of climate information. Index insurance, which was already mentioned. Through the R4 Rural Resilience Initiative, farmers have the option to purchase index insurance for coverage against the worst drought years. It's based on rainfall, which can unlock more productive risk-taking and contribute to increased resilience. In 2015, 3,600 Senegalese farmers purchased the insurance, and the late start of the rainy season triggered a payout for the majority of those farmers. I'll leave it at that and take any questions. That's it.
Thank you very much for that excellent, really comprehensive overview of the risks facing the region and the ongoing challenges to peace and security in the region from climate change. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. I'm going to give you a very quick introduction to our very distinguished panel that we're very pleased to have with us today. To my left is Dr. Jassim Al-Falahi, Deputy Minister for Environment in Iraq and the President of the Iraq delegation to COP22. Dr. Jassim has been proactively pursuing actions to address the human security risks to climate vulnerability in Iraq, and a true leader on this issue in cooperation with the UNDP and many other agencies in the country. And it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Jassim with us today. Thank you very much. Next is Dr. Wadid Arian, Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction at the League of Arab States. Among various other roles he has in the region, he was formerly director at the Arab Center for Study of Arid and Dryland Zones, which was based in Damascus, Syria at the time. He's a contributor to the Global Assessment Report, IPCC, and many global leading publications and studies. Thank you, Dr. Wadid, for joining us today. We have with us Mr. Frank Fass-Metz, who is the Commissioner for Climate and the Deputy Director General at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, Germany, leading the special unit for climate since February 2015. And he is responsible for overseeing BMZ's work on climate policy and climate finance. Thank you, Frank, for joining us today. And I will also be joining the panel. I've already introduced myself, and I won't do that again. I'm with UNDP. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to our moderator for this expert debate and panel, which will be an interactive discussion with questions after to discuss with the audience. And I hand over to my good friend Abdul Latif Bello from the Islamic Development Bank Group, please.
Thank you, Kishan. My name is Abdul Latif Bello from Islamic Development Bank. For the next 1 hour plus, I will be the moderator for the rest of this event. I'm happy to have this knowledgeable expert with us. You recall that in 2008, we had a set of crises that has, over the years, multiplied to a different problem. In 2008, as you recall, we had 3 Fs, the food, fuel, and financial crisis. At that time, we saw that many of our member countries were running at a scatter to address the issue of food security. You had this time of land grabbing. Many of them had to go to fertile countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Now, it appears the crisis cycle has become more frequent than we used to think of. We are now in a new cycle of crisis, which I would describe as refugees, climate change, and conflict instability. And I'm happy that today we'll be focusing on some of the success factors to really address climate change, which is peace and security. So I will start with the Deputy Minister of Environment, Iraq, and I will pose this question to him, that Iraq, as we know, faces a very serious security threat from climate change, with drought affecting food and water security, spread of sandstorms, internet displacement, and other forms of insecurity. Mr. Deputy Minister, in your view, can you tell us what are the major security risks from climate change in Iraq today and going into the future?
Well, thank you very much. And really, it's a great opportunity. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity, and specific thanks for the Islamic Development Bank and the UNDP to give us the honor to attend here. Really, I want to talk about the region, specifically on my country as an example for the region that affected hugely by the effect of the climate change. The major risk that my country and the region has been exposed was the increase in the temperature, the drought, and the scarcity of the water, in addition to the increase the incidence of the dust storm. And just I want to explain something, the effect of the climate change on what's called the socio-ecological system. in this region, especially in my country. And we know in my country, and during our contribution and our collaborations with other countries, with our partners, with the Paris Agreement, that the Iraq specifically, or the region, and Iraq especially, is the most vulnerable area that has been affected by the climate change. We have the incidence of increasing the temperature from the southern area to the middle and then to the northern area of Iraq. The most important risk, I think, we should pay the attention regarding the water scarcity. And we know very well that we have some problem regarding the water security and then the food security in our country, because we have some problem regarding the controlling process or the policy of controlling the water resources of Iraq. You know very well that about 87 of our water resources come from outside, especially from our neighbors, from Turkey, and about 75 and from the Iranian side, so that we have some sort of controlling policy problem regarding the water resources. In addition to that, the increase in the temperature will affect special people of my popularity, especially the old age and children. And the most affected area was the rural area, especially the rural agricultural area, and the most affected one is the women in the rural area. So that the Iraq was a very good example about the effect of a climate change that could be touchable. And you know very well, I'm so happy to talk about the peace and security and the climate change. This triangle for us is very important, because you know very well that we are suffering a lot and from many wars. And what has been happening now, we are fighting a terrorist action, and all of this will make some sort of diminish and minimizing the already we have the financial crisis, and also this will affect the efforts of my government in order to face this. So this is the main risk, and I think that we have this problem. We pay a very good attention. You know, the oil production was the main source of our financial resources in Iraq, although we are going from the beginning through the Iraqi INDCs in order to go with the international community in order to minimize the effect of the increasing the temperature. And you know, we are now in the process of the agreement for the Paris Agreement. This will affect our economy. In spite of this risk, we should follow, because we want to make some sort of multifocal resources for our economy. Also, we insist on what's called the renewable energy effect. We don't want to depend upon this. And now we have, really, we should say something that we have a deficit in our strategy regarding the controlling the water resources, and also what we should do regarding our financial problems. But now my government pay a very good attention, especially regarding the poverty strategy too. The environmental aspect was strongly involved in this, and we now consist and insist on a very important issues regarding how to save our people from the expecting results or the effect of the climate change. The agricultural aspects increase the land degradation, increase the effect of the dust storm, and now we have, and with the cooperation with the international organization UNDP, we have a specific scientific study regarding the effect of climate change on the health of many people, and we take asthma as an example. So we think that there is a major risk in Iraq now, and we think that the most important thing was the water scarcity, the food insecurity, and also the effect of the increase the temperature of our people. We hope that, and with the assistance of the international committee and with the respective organization like UNDP, we put our policy, specific policy, which has been involved in the Iraqi INDCs in order to resolve the expected problems and the risk in the future. And also we follow the international criteria regarding the mitigation and adaptation aspects. And now we have a real interest regarding how to save our resources, especially the water resources. And I find this is a very good chance to really to explain my deep thanks for the UNDP, especially Dr. Nadir Aboud and Dr. Tariq Islam for their deep and very good efforts that they support our government in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jassim. We thank Dr. Jassim for taking us through the challenges facing Iraq from the aspect of peace and security in the context of climate change. Dr. Wadid Iran from the Arab League, we know that the Arab world is undertaking a transition, and Dr. Jassim has highlighted some of the key areas dealing with climate change. From your perspective, can you really tell us what are the existing social vulnerabilities in the Arab world that could really mitigate against addressing climate change?
First, I would like to thank you for inviting me to attend this meeting. I would like to tell you that the subject is very interesting to all of us to know that this region is not only time receiving such drought impacts and migration and displacement especially taking place now. We have recognized this 4,000 years ago in this region. And if you go to Syria and the areas between Syria and Jordan and also Iraq, the Fertile Crescent area, you will see at least 3,000 and something of small hills covering all the villages because of the 300 years of drought caused already that the dust storms covered all those villages and they have been buried under the dust. And people left to areas for irrigation. It was the same time where the Maya civilization disappeared on Latin America, and this remained for 300 years. So if we are talking now about drought land degradation in general, this is one of the multi-stresses facing Arab region. We have what we call the unique stresses of the social, where we can see all the time that we have water scarcity. Most of the countries, 16 of the 22 Arab countries are under water stresses. Food security, we import almost 50% of our cereal crops from outside. And the budget for this has increased, especially on the drought cycles. It's jumped from $18 billion to $36 billion in 2008, 2009. Again, we have the poverty level increasing, and we can see also that the food supplies from World Food Program increased in 5 years. The Arab Spring time, it's covering, instead of 5 million, this is a normal figure we used to have in the region. Now we are talking about 25 million. But if we are talking about countries like Syria, for instance, Syria lost 40 years of development. And before that, Iraq also lost the chances of, I don't want to say how many decades of development because of the wars happening in this region. The estimation of poverty increase in the region because of the Arab Spring time can be recognized easily, and it is now became a reason for immigration, displacement, conflicts. But this is what I called the unique stresses. This is what we are living with, without the drought, without any other hydro or biophysical climate stresses. Now we have the biophysical climate stresses coming to the region. 46% of the Arab countries are under drought effect. 60% of the Arab countries are under land degradation. The severity land degradation and the drought is causing by itself a displacement in each decade of about 10 million to leave their lands, and that caused the Arab region in 50 years what we can see now, the disordered areas in the cities. Urban has changed in most of the Arab countries, in the big capitals, and we can see a lot of slums areas and people living there without jobs, which is really organized because they are just came because of land degradation and drought causes. Country like Somalia, depending on its GDP on agriculture by 60%. Of course, if you have a drought cycle in Somalia, immediately you will see a lot of refugees going outside. If you know that the Arab region is losing 1.16% from its rangeland annually and 0.9% of the forest annually, you can imagine the crop losses and how the impact is really severe. Now we are talking about temperature. And the people are talking about, we hope that we can just stand with the figure of 2 degrees only. But I will tell you that in most of the Arab region areas, we recognized and we have measured that we already exceeded 2.5 degrees in many places in Arab region during the last 50 years. And in some places during summertime, even we exceeded more than this. So this is by itself something we have to recognize, that most of the urban countries of Gulf, urban cities of Gulf countries where 100% of the people are living are under the threat of the heat waves and increase of temperatures that it might reach already 60 degrees in some time and has been recorded. So 60 degrees in summertime, and we are just in 2017. Country like Kuwait, for instance, because of the drought and because also of the dust storms coming from Iraq, spend $5 billion annually to clean the highways. And that will tell us the severity of the problem and how much the cost of solving this problem. So the multi-stresses we are talking about is including the social part and also including the biophysical part. And the only solution to cope with it is to build resilience. And that's why resilience is a key factor for social vulnerability and how to keep the Arab region surviving under what they used to for is the normal changes and the normal atmosphere and the normal cases of normal growing of population. And the water scarcity, which we have 60% or 65% of our water, is a transboundary water. So we know that we have all those stresses, but now with the biophysical stresses, this is brought a load. One point I would like just to add before finishing answering your question. One American scientist said 20 years ago that the increase of 1 degree in temperature increased the conflicts by 50 times. 50 times. And one Egyptian famous author, Hassanin Haikal, he wrote that we lost with our battles with Israel, around 50,000 had been murdered during those wars. But in reality, we lost 2.2 million inhabitants and people because of the conflicts happened in the last 30 years. So this is the effect of 1 degree increase. And now we are talking about 2.5 in many places as increase in temperature.
Thank you, Dr. Walid, for giving us the big picture of situation in the Arab world. I will now move to Dr. Kishan. From the UNDP perspective, I know UNDP has been giving a lot of financial assistance as well as grants to a number of member countries globally. We noticed that over 2.8 billion in portfolio of grant projects were financed globally for low carbon and climate resilience solutions so far. The question I want to pose to you is, from UNDP extensive experience, which we know you have gathered over the years around the world, what are the good practices that you think could help countries manage their own climate risk and build resilience to growing forms of insecurity?
Thank you, Abdul Latif. Definitely, I mean, we started to provide support on climate adaptation after the launch of the UN Climate Change Convention in the early 90s. So for the last 25 years, almost, we've been working with countries on this agenda, various different contexts around the world. I would say very briefly, we support upstream and we support downstream. So on the upstream side, I think definitely it's been an important lesson to build capacity development of environment ministries, of local agencies, to be able to take into account the climate factor in their development planning, in their security actions, or their conflict prevention or crisis prevention work. But capacity development at the institutional level and the policy level, mainstreaming climate change into development policy, this is still quite important now, in fact. And downstream, building what we call community-based approaches to resilience, the capacity of communities and civil society organizations, NGOs at the local level, to be able to withstand those shocks from the drought. Sometimes very remote communities who have to take action, even they have to be resilient in their own right, in addition to the support they get from their government. So I think building community capacities. So upstream and downstream is one lesson. Specific things that we've done over the years that we're kind of focused on now, trying to scale up. One, of course, is early warning systems. I think in the Arab region in particular, there's a need to strengthen and expand this topic about early warning systems for taking into account this new, hopefully 2-degree increased world, if not 3-degree or more, if depending on the ambition and the actions and the success of the Paris Agreement. But early warning systems and how this can trigger the domestic local migration, rural to urban, even the international migration within the region, outside the region. The second lesson I would say is on the role of social protection policies and mechanisms. We're now expanding our work on things like climate indexed insurance products. So how do we work together with the finance community, the banking community, to build capacities of local insurance companies in the Arab region and national ministries to produce new insurance product for farmers. So when they face these impacts from climate change, they're able to withstand the shock through insurance products as one of the main social protection tools that governments have in their toolbox to prevent that kind of vulnerability. And last but not least, just to end, is the role of solar power for recovery. So in the region, of course, one of our functions, our support roles, is to support the recovery efforts in places affected by conflict. So when we provide our support to the host communities in Lebanon and Jordan hosting the Syrian refugees, we're now integrating decentralized solar power solutions for cooking, for lighting, for street lighting in the host communities for the benefit, because those communities, of course, are facing a lot of pressures from the increased population, and they're already energy poor countries, Jordan and Lebanon. We do this also for internally displaced communities, IDPs, for example, in Yemen, where the grid is gone, power grid is gone. So decentralized energy solutions for internally displaced communities in Yemen also. And so this is something that we're expanding our work, the role of solar solutions for recovery and resilient recovery. So these are very briefly a few points.
Okay, thank you, Kishan. I'll move to Mr. Frank Fels-Mess. I hope I get your name right. If you recall, a year ago, under the G7 German presidency, there was a special report entitled A Climate for Peace, which is really relevant to our discussion today, which elaborated the growing risk from climate change for issues like displacement, conflict, and security. Now, how can we enhance the action of development partners to address the climate and security nexus and ensure that new global initiatives to implement the Paris Climate Agreement can help improve resilience in fragile states?
Thank you very much for the question. And first, I want to thank the Islamic Development Bank and UNDP for inviting us and being able to share some thoughts with you. And thank you for the reference on the report we presented in the G7 presidency. And I would like to recall also that Germany was the first country to bring climate change to the UN Security Council for a debate on the nexus between climate change and security. I want to start with one dimension which affects Germany right now. We have seen last year an inflow of migrants and refugees to Germany of about 900,000 people, which is unprecedented in Germany and makes very visible that we are all living in one world, and what we do in one place of the world affects other places of the world. And it brings to the public the understanding that we need to act jointly. It's nothing only for academia or government, but it's for the broad public. So the awareness of the need to act is very clear. We see that climate change will amplify potential threats for security, will aggravate fragile situations, will increase disasters caused by extreme weather events. We saw from Dr. Kelly the science behind this, and all this will contribute to social upheaval and conflict. But climate change does not directly trigger conflicts. It aggravates the underlying factors. Nevertheless, we live the consequences, we see them, and I would like to highlight that the consequences are seen in countries where the conflicts are. And the issue of refugees, I referred to Germany, is a small issue compared to the refugee situations in countries in the Arab region. So the question is, what needs to be done? What can development partners do in this regard? And the first and most important point I want to make: be ambitious on mitigation actions. This is crucial what we need to do, and developed countries need to take the lead in this regard. Germany always has been on the forefront on this, taking up its own responsibilities. And it's now with the Paris Agreement that we have a framework for global action in this regard. Furthermore, what we do is we support developing countries in implementing their national determined contributions in order to address what is needed to make the transformation for a low carbon and climate resilient development. And this has a mitigation side, but very importantly also the adaptation side, the side of risk prevention, the side of risk response. I can say that Germany will increase its climate finance. Our Chancellor pledged this last year from the budget from 2 billion a year to 4 billion in 2020. At 2015, we saw that we have climate finance from the budget of 2.7 billion only this year, 2015, and 45% is for adaptation. Furthermore, what we engaged with G7 leaders 2015 to launch a G7 initiative to promote index-based climate insurance. G7 leaders pledged that by 2020 they want to ensure that 400 million people, additional people in poor and vulnerable countries, would be covered with climate risk insurance mechanisms. Last year in Paris, we saw the start of a rapid action package. G7 put on the table $420 million to start, and we think we can cover 180 million people by 2020 only through this financial support, which is provided by development partners. I would like to make one final point. I think what needs to be done, and we will engage in this, and we want to cooperate with developing countries in this regard, to shift the focus from responding to risk to rather managing risks. And by the natural, be them natural or human-induced risks. So particularly in fragile countries, we need to develop and apply a multi-risk management approach, bringing on board several dimensions which were discussed today, and break the silos between them and integrate climate, disaster, and security risk in a holistic manner to strengthen overall resilience. And that's a commitment we have to work with developing countries in this line. Thank you.
Yeah, for Dr. Colin, thank you for the presentation you gave to us in your keynote address, especially the one on a good example of this climate index insurance in Senegal, which to me is more of promoting inclusive growth. If you look at the pillars of inclusive growth, you have access to basic services, giving equal opportunities, employment opportunities, and the last one is social safety net, which I see this insurance fitting quite well into the last pillar, social safety net. With that background, I know that there are many ways climate change can really trigger displacement. We have all been talking about migration crisis, and it has been a major focus. And people have been talking about the convergence between climate change and conflicts in the Arab region. But it is also important root in climate risk emerging in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Now, in your view, how will you, characterize climate change exacerbating migration trends globally in coming years?
Thank you. And thank you to the Islamic Development Bank for inviting me to this discussion, and my esteemed colleagues. I will add to a lot of the comments that they've already made in this discussion, and say that I think first it's important to consider that, sometimes we have a habit of thinking of climate change as a global phenomenon, and it is. But the fingerprints of climate change have a very regional flavor as well. Every country and every region is experiencing different symptoms of climate change, and in varying degrees. And it's important to keep this in mind. But with that in mind, I think that it's also very important to consider that, as Dr. Arian mentioned before, that each country is very unique in its vulnerability and its resilience. And the combination of factors that comes together in the case of each country or each region to provide a lack of resilience or vulnerability in those places must be established before you can really begin to know what the effects of regional climate change will be in those locations. So it's very important that we move forward in our assessment of real-time resilience and vulnerability, not only real-time drought assessment and other factors, but a comprehensive way of approaching this to combine the variables that matter most. But first, it's important to do these case studies for these different countries to see what they have in common and what they don't. And I mentioned Syria and Yemen before. Syria and Yemen have experienced a very similar population increase and an increase in the demand for water since 1950. They're both agrarian societies, but they're very different in terms of their climate change impacts. Syria, the Fertile Crescent, has essentially 6 months of rainfall from November to April, and the other 6 months there's very little rainfall. In Yemen, which is a tropical country, there are two distinct rainy seasons. There are the spring rains and there are the summer monsoon. And they're separated by a dry month of June. And in the Yemen case, there's not a clear decline in rainfall over the last 35 years, but there is a significant increase in temperature that we know is prevalent throughout the Middle East. I bring this up to point out that through the agricultural differences that Yemen and Syria also have, that the relationship between the agriculture and the water stress and the other factors and how they experience regional climate change is very important in order to establish what the overall resilience and vulnerability is. I think that this is a very important coming area of research. It's a difficult question to answer. I was recently at a workshop several months ago where the Department of Defense was having a science and technology workshop in Washington, D.C., and it was about conflict modeling. And one of the things that became obvious to me was that, first of all, the Department of Defense and the intelligence community in the U.S. and in many other countries has known that there is a strong relationship between climate and security for some time. This is not something that they have just realized. And so they've been trying to, through different groups, model conflict and have a better idea of preparedness and these kinds of things. But what I realized is that these different groups come at it from very different points of view. The CIA representative there was looking at slow-moving variables, and they determined that there were maybe 3 variables that they considered were most important, but they were not considering shocks, droughts, these kinds of things that we know to be very important. And there were other groups that were coming at it from a much higher resolution, time resolution point of view. And there were some that were coming at it from a top-down approach, considering 100 countries and trying to consider all the variables that matter and treat them as if it's the same from country to country. And I think that that's not the correct approach, but that there is some value to be gained by examining that. But by looking at case studies, as we talked about earlier, you can start to see what the similarities and the differences are and be able to learn from that and be able to move forward in your assessment of resilience and vulnerability, and then to have better predictive capacity. And so to get back to your question, I would say that overall, globally, we would expect that under continued climate change and how it's experienced regionally, that we can expect that there will be more migration in the future. But that's not to suggest climate determinism, and I want to make that point very clear, that wherever we see climate change, that there will be more conflict. That's not the case. There is the opportunity for increased cooperation and diplomacy related to transboundary water rights and other factors that I think is very important, and that there's a lot that can be done to try and mitigate and stave off the worst effects of conflict and migration in the future.
Just a follow-up question. Some months ago, before this meeting, there was a study conducted in the UK in one of these universities where they said climate change will lead to about 250 million migrating globally. From your own perspective, how do we address this issue? How can we really stop this from happening? We know the figure, we know the underlying causes. How can we ensure that if we step in on time, we can reduce this number from getting to 250 million?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and really it's a bit out of my area of expertise to predict that. But what I will say is that I'll go back to the idea that if we know that these things are happening now and we know what is likely to be occurring in the future, then we should take action as soon as possible. We should not dawdle and waste any more time, that there are things that need to be done now. And this is, again, different in every region and in every country, related to governance and economy and access to water and cooperation and all these kinds of issues, that there's still hope that we can try to deal with these issues more proactively rather than to give in to the idea that is the ultimate outcome.
Thank you. Mr. Frank, in the last few days, every events we have been hearing people talking about climate resilience. From your own perspective, how can we really address this climate resilience in fragile states?
Well, climate resilience, from our perspective, will imply that we better understand the impacts of climate change. So we need to invest in getting information. Systems of generating relevant information, for instance, through meteorological services, are one key dimension. And the other dimension, I think, is the way how are we going to react to the impacts of climate change. And we need to move to a system where we really manage these risks which are associated to climate change, being them natural factors or eventually the conflicts associated with scarcity of water or other natural resources would be part of a multi-risk management approach. And the challenge in fragile states where there is high risk of deterioration of natural resources. We heard about the water stress in the Arab region, the issues related to increasing deforestation, that from the support perspective we need to link the relief dimension, the rehabilitation dimension and the development dimension within the context of climate change. This might imply also some hard choices. In our bilateral development cooperation, we introduced a system of climate proofing all our support programs. And we are engaged in a program providing water for the city of Damascus in Jordan. And the analysis showed that the availability of water will provide for continued growth for 20 years. But then there's no sufficient water. So the challenge is to react to this challenge and looking on how development then should be steered. What are the solutions for growing countries where the scarcity of water will limit the possibility to grow? And factoring in this analysis already today will help in preventing conflicts in 20 years from now. So climate proofing today, looking ahead what's going to happen, is a key factor for reacting to the challenge. And as I said, of course, the responsibility of the global community to act on the mitigation side is crucial. And the other dimension of the support obligations of developed countries is another factor, and where we are clear that we will honor our commitments to support.
Let me turn to UNDP. We know that you're always on the ground in member countries providing capacity development as well as financial assistance. Now, we are at a particular point where countries have already developed their climate change action plan, the so-called NDC. Now we've seen also the Paris Climate Agreement ratified. It has come to full effect. The question I have for you is, how do we take action? Going back that we have two major things, the bottom-up approach where countries develop the action plan, and then we have international agreement ratified. How do we take action in terms of ensuring that we mainstream peace and security in the implementation of the action plan?
Apologies for jumping in. I just need to excuse myself. I made a mistake. Our bilateral program is with Amman, not with Damascus. So to be very clear, apologies for that mistake. Sorry.
So, so far in the Arab region, we have, let's say, I think 5-6 countries that have ratified now the Paris Climate Change Agreement as of today. I think Morocco, Algeria, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, maybe one or two more during the COP probably. So, I mean, this is the first step, of course, is ratification and full entry into the agreement. Nevertheless, of course, countries have already submitted their NDCs, as you said, their INDCs, their intended contributions. So I think we have to see these climate plans as development plans, really. If you take the case of a country like Egypt, where its NDC is an action plan of $75 billion of climate actions, just as an example, including prevention of climate-induced migration in the Nile Delta, for example, which is one of the global hotspots for sea level rise and 20 million people affected in the next few decades by pressure on migration from sea level rise, just as one example. But the same goes for other NDCs. If we take the case of Iraq, of course, Iraq's NDC is very much acknowledging the link between climate change and human insecurity in the NDC expressly. It's very expressed in the Iraq NDC, maybe more than any other country, actually, if you read all the NDCs. So these are plans that already factor into significant extent this issue that we're discussing today, because it's a natural issue in these countries. So to make those happen, from a UNDP side now, we're taking a lead to help countries develop their submissions to the Green Climate Fund. So we're doing UNDP GCF projects in countries. We now have close to 10 projects approved globally over the last year or so, about $250 million of grants, mainly for climate adaptation. So we're the UN's largest provider of grant assistance from the Green Climate Fund today for climate adaptation already. In the Arab region, specifically in this region, in Middle East, North Africa, we're developing with our national partners projects for the Green Climate Fund adaptation track of work, about 5-6 countries. We have projects under development in Sudan, in Somalia, in Djibouti, in Egypt, in Tunisia. And these are specifically on this topic. So if you look at the project that we're developing, $40 million GCF project for Sudan, it's very much focused on building climate resilience to food and water security. And of course, Sudan has one of the world's highest levels of IDPs, of internally displaced people, millions. So any climate action in Sudan helps to address this issue. Same in Somalia, to say the least. It's also facing this issue, decades of internal displacement and recurring droughts. So this climate action adaptation projects also take this as a front and center, this kind of human insecurity and displacement issue. Egypt, as I said, the Nile Delta, trying to prevent climate-induced migration in the Nile Delta. And even Tunisia, the coastal sea level rise issue. So we're really taking concrete action to actually develop projects that will be submitted for review and consideration by the Green Climate Fund and other partners for taking action on this issue in this region. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Wadid, because you are generally looking after Arab region, can you just tell us how are you coordinating regional responses to social vulnerability in the context of climate change?
I will just try to give you something new in using science. And now everyone is talking about mixing social science with natural science. And I will try now to tell you some examples in the next way. I was in a meeting in World Bank in April, and there was a discussion about how Israel is going to be a solution for the world water crisis. I asked myself a question in my mind, and I answered this one in a conference hosted by the League of Arab States about water under occupation. And I said how Israel is introducing itself as a solution while it is still occupying some areas and using the water. So I said, let's look about the word science. Israel managed now to come with the producing of desalinized water with the price of $0.5, half dollar. And that means we can use the technology in the Arab region as a solution, because the water they are using now under occupation is costing Israel between 12 to 42 cents, which means if we add to this the military weapons and equipment they use to protect their country and also to bring more security to Israel, I think they spend more. So if we manage to make dialogue for the use of science for desalinized water, it will going to be a solution between Israel and the Palestinian and the other occupied territory for the Arab territory. That was discussed under the League of Arab States. This is the role of science. And we are talking about Egypt, and we are talking about seawater rise in Mediterranean. So we have a lot of areas where in Egypt there is a lowland, internal lowland. So if you pump water internally with desalinization using the nuclear power or solar energy, you can reduce the seawater rise, and at the same time you can cultivate and bring more solution internally. So there is a lot of things can be answered in building resilience, because resilience is to be built strategically from the regional point of view, national point of view, till you come to the local. And there is 3 opportunities now the League of Arab States introduced. We introduced Arab Geographical Information Room to give solutions for how we can introduce new ideas using the geographical information tool. Second, we are working with UNDP, with World Food Program, to build League of Arab States Climate Risk Nexus initiative. And we are also planning now to start, because we are talking about sustainable development goals, to have sustainable development climate resilience nexus facility. And with these tools, the League of Arab States aims at introducing new ideas, depend on science and technology, coming to decision makers with new ideas and trying to solve the problems of resilience and building more resilience in community level, national level, to cope with the challenges we are facing. Thank you.
I will turn now to the audience, because we're running against time. So there will be opportunity for you to ask questions. So please, when you take the floor, introduce yourself, and then if you want to. Okay, I think the Deputy Minister wants to say one word. So okay, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Just I want to mention something which is very important for us, and how my government addressed some policy regarding the climate change, peace and security. We think that the increase in temperature, the water scarcity, and the the incidence of drought and the dust storm will affect mainly the life and the health of the people. And we believe that the next step of displacement was because of the climate change. We know very well that we have more than 3 million of my people has been obligated to be displaced because of the terrorist action. And now we are planning for a new strategy regarding the effect, or to minimize the effect of the climate change. And we want to address some what's called for a new resilient environment or resilient nation in Iraq, with the help of the international committee and with the respective UN organization, depending on something, depending on more than, depending on also the understanding of my people, and depending on 5,000 years of ancient civilization. And I think that the Iraqi people, depending on this ancient history, will be a very good example for a resilient nation against the climate change. Thank you.
Now we move to the question and answer session. Who would like to take the floor first? Anyone? Any question? Okay, someone in the front here.
Thank you very much. Nadir Aboud Faza. I'm a national consultant from Iraq. Actually, I don't have a specific question, but I have a comment on the lecture of Professor Colin. It is very interesting lecture, actually, and really it is a key point. And I want to ask something. You mentioned several information about Yemen and Syria. And I'm right now a PhD student at Newcastle University in the UK. And I'm doing impact of climate change on Iraq and trying to answer a very important question about is the marshland in Iraq exposed and vulnerable to climate change. And we have really good results, and I'm happy to sharing that with you. I'm thinking our results will be fit in your lecture and will complete the image of your study. Thank you very much.
We wish you good luck in your PhD. I don't know whether Dr. Colin will have any feedback or comment on his remarks. Okay. Can you speak?
Thank you for your comments. I spoke a lot about Syria and Yemen, but these are only two examples. I mean, obviously there are many countries to consider, and certainly even in the greater Fertile Crescent. So I'm always happy to look at new information and new research that's being done in that region, and be happy to converse further with you about it.
Follow-up question?
And the results, we think the marshland of Iraq is a very important area for Iraq. And we are trying, because our marshland is mixed, as Dr. Jassim mentioned, between environment and people. So it is we define marshland as socio-ecological systems. And we evaluated the impact of the risks, raising of temperature and decrease of rainfall. And our conclusion that these important will impact on the shifting the species and people, and that will be a very significant point in the marshland. Marshland as a case study, that will make a displacement stress on the nearest provinces, and even will impact on the species, on the animal species, on the migratory species as well. So we evaluated that on the socio-ecological part and the natural part, and we think that this case study will be fit, and we are trying to evaluate that on all over Iraq, because that will make a migration, internal migration, and will increase the conflict in Iraq, and we have some solutions for that. Thank you very much.
I suggest that after this event, you can have bilateral discussion with Dr. Colin. Thank you for raising most of this point. There's a lady here who would like to raise a question.
Excuse me. Hello, everybody. I would like to, I will introduce myself. I'm Suzanne El-Banna, Iraqi National Focal Point on Climate Change to UNFCCC. Before everything, I would like to thank ISDB Group Pavilion for this event, which is very important to us. And at the same time, I would like to ask all the panel about what is happening in the meeting rooms. As a negotiator, I found there is a huge difference between what is happening there at the meeting groups and at the negotiating groups, and what is happening here in the side events, and what the scientists are saying about the important effects of climate change on developing countries. I found when you enter the meeting rooms, there is a battle between developing countries and developed countries and least developed countries. How we can manage this? How we can show the developed countries that we are suffering? We are suffering from climate change, and we need their support to be able to face what we are facing in our countries because of climate change. So we need to build resilient to our minds before build resilient to our climate and to our environment. I think this is most important thing, and this thing is one that need to build to have in our shoulders to highlight it in front the policymakers to be able to understand what we are suffering from. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Will one of the panel members want to take over I take up the question? Okay.
Maybe just quickly before I hand over to Wadid. I mean, one of the things UNDP that we've been supporting, helping the most vulnerable countries, is the establishment of something called the Climate Vulnerability Forum, or CVF, which is a global initiative that UNDP supports together with the generous support of various donor countries to actually raise the voice and the issues of the most vulnerable countries in the world, the small island states, least developed countries, but increasingly also countries from this region, which are fragile states, also climate hotspots, as well as conflict-affected hotspots. So linked to that, of course, was the leadership of the member countries in that process. We provide technical assistance, but it's led by the member countries. And they established what's called the V20 in Paris, the most vulnerable 20 countries, to advocate the pressing issues of climate vulnerability to the G20 and other global powers. So the CVF and the V20 is one of the initiatives that we're proud to be providing technical assistance to countries.
In fact, we just heard from Germany that whatever is happening in any place is affecting other places. And in reality, this is very important to recognize, and this is one of the ways to build the dialogue. The dialogue that we are living in one planet, either we are rich or poor. And we know that if we are not working together hand by hand, so whoever is living far will be affected, but whatever is coming to the people living in any place in the globe. So I believe the dialogue is very important. Political sides and also economic impacts, the rate of growth, and all the international understanding for how we can really go together and build the development and reach with development levels that can really reach the poor people also to bring them more up. I think all those ideas. That's why you can see inside the rooms where there is delegations, this kind of way of talking. But I believe globally, all of us from the other side, we look to the subject that if we don't act together, we will lose all of us.
I can entertain one more question. So.
Sorry.
Okay.
If you allow me, moderator, I would like to join the discussion on this point and pick up on the last point my predecessor made. I think we know the problem. Science is telling us what is the problem, what will be the impact. Where the difficulty is to understand what is the responsibility to act of all of us. And we have been discussing over many years to finding a solution for that. And we have not been very successful. However, we agreed the Paris Agreement last year with an approach that everybody will determine its own contribution to find a solution. And through a collaborative approach, then acting jointly for solutions. Everybody in its own capabilities, of course, and developed countries have usually more capabilities than developing countries, but there will be a differentiation on implementation, and there will be a responsibility from developed countries to support developing countries. Only if we have this collaborative approach, we will be successful. My first point. My second point, the negotiation process will give us guidance on where to go, but the real action must come from the ground. So every country really needs to start implementing, and I made reference to the NDC partnership, Germany, Morocco, and other 42 institutions, countries launched yesterday to enhance implementation through early action. So that we all have an incentive to start working, implementing the commitments on climate within the framework of development, which we have from last year, the SDG agenda, through collaborative action. That would be my answer. And the solutions for the individual people will not come from negotiations, but from countries. Thank you.
I think we'll be drawing the curtain here. We have, in the last 1 hour, there's another event taking place here in the next 5-10 minutes. So we have really benefited a lot from the knowledge of our speakers. The last 1 hour has been very, very stimulating. We have really drawn a lot of knowledge and experience from the expertise, as well as the knowledge of this expert. So on this note, we would like you to really give a round of applause to our speakers. I will call on Kishan to give the vote of thanks.
No, just to say thank you for all of you for joining us today. This is not the end of this topic, and we'll be happy to be following up on this event with our partners from the Islamic Development Bank, from the League of Arab States, from Germany, and others on taking action on this issue in coming years to go from talk to action. So thank you again for coming, and have a great day.
Excuse me, before you go, I think there is some items they want to give to UNDP and IDB and then the panel members. So please, you may stay behind and watch, or stay behind to participate in the next event. Thank you all. Ladies and gentlemen, we have refreshment outside, tea, and then some cookies. So please, we invite you to participate in it.